At 5:42 local time, the Strait of Hormuz appeared calm, almost deceptively peaceful in the early light. A narrow stretch of steel blue water lay between harsh coastlines, while commercial shipping lanes were just beginning to come alive. USS Gerald R. Ford maintained her place in the transit formation, the enormous hull moving ahead with the steady mechanical confidence of a warship built for moments like this. On the bridge, every movement was purposeful. Inside the Combat Information Center, the watch team monitored the familiar mix of merchant vessels, fishing traffic, coastal echoes, and distant radar signals drifting across the displays. Then the picture changed. A radar operator leaned in and called out the first irregularity. Multiple high-speed surface contacts emerging from the northern side of the strait. Low profile, compact, and accelerating. Seconds later, another report followed. New air tracks, small, fast, and too numerous to dismiss. They were not approaching from one direction alone. They were spreading. Inside CIC, no one lost control. The tension simply sharpened. Symbols multiplied across the screens. Confidence ratings shifted. Bearings updated in real time. A tactical display that had looked stable only moments earlier, now filled with motion. One controller focused on the surface group. Another worked the low-altitude air picture, cutting through coastal clutter and inconsistent returns. Sensor data from the escort ships began feeding in as well, refining the geometry. At 5:43, the first assessment came through in clipped, unmistakable language. This was coordinated. On the bridge, the captain never raised his voice. He remained fixed on the forward windows and repeater displays, taking in each report as it arrived. Maintain course. Tighten the screen. Confirm identification. Keep the formation intact. The commands were brief because they had to be. In restricted waters, hesitation could be just as dangerous as the threat itself. Along the carrier's flanks, the escorts reacted almost at once. One destroyer edged farther to starboard, exposing itself slightly to improve its intercept angle. Another shifted aft to reinforce the rear sector. Every adjustment was deliberate. The formation could not afford to break apart. Not here, not in waters this confined. At 5:44, electronic support measures detected stronger emissions from shore. Search radar was one thing. This was different. The pattern had shifted from observation to targeting behavior. A watchstander marked the source on one console. On another, a supervisor asked for confirmation twice, already knowing what the answer would be. The fast surface contacts kept closing. Visual observers on the outer ships were now picking them up as dark shapes skimming low over the water, throwing white spray behind them as they advanced at speed. They were small enough to blend into the sea state, but not small enough to overlook. Some held a direct approach, others split wider, spreading out as if to stretch the American screen and force difficult choices. Above them, the air picture worsened. The low, erratic tracks that had first appeared as uncertain returns now held steady long enough to be classified as deliberate movement. Most likely unmanned systems, drones, small radar signatures, low altitude, approaching through shoreline clutter and background noise, using terrain masking to stay difficult to track for as long as possible. At 5:45, activity on the flight deck shifted instantly. Sailors who had been moving through standard transit procedures snapped into combat rhythm. Aircraft topside were secured where they stood. Loose gear disappeared under strict tie-down discipline. Firefighting teams moved to their assigned stations. The deck did not descend into chaos. It became precise. Far below, magazines, damage control lockers, and repair teams all stepped one level closer to full battle readiness. Inside CIC, the voices remained steady, almost cold. Surface Group 1 continuing inbound. Air tracks now multiple groups. Escort sensors confirm. Recommend weapons posture shift. No panic, no wasted language. Just information, decisions, execution. At 5:46, the structure of the attack was impossible to misread. The Iranian boats were not rushing forward as a disorganized mass. They were separating into attack lanes, probing the edges of the formation, forcing the escorts to watch multiple sectors at once. The drones were timed to arrive as pressure and distraction, not as one reckless wave. From shore, emissions continued to pulse and intensify. The entire pattern pointed to the same conclusion. This was designed to overload attention before the first missile ever left its launcher. The captain gave the order to move fully into defensive action. Across the formation, launch systems came alive. Radars locked in harder. Combat systems teams shifted from monitoring to engagement logic. Ford remained at the center, not passive, not concealed, but shielded by doctrine, steel, and the men and women who understood exactly how narrow the margin could become in water like this. At 5:47, one of the destroyers screening the carrier reported the first critical development. Its sensors had pulled a new track out of the shoreline clutter, fast, low, and inbound over the water. Then a second, then more. For half a second, CIC seemed to compress to a single point, every eye fixed on the same section of the display. Range numbers began to drop, bearing lines sharpened. The surface contacts were still advancing. The drones were still descending. And now the first sea-skimming missiles were arriving just beneath the line of the morning horizon. The watch officer did not need to explain what everyone in the room already understood. Missile launch confirmed. That was the moment the transit ended, and the fight for USS Gerald R. Ford began. 5:47 local time. Missile launch confirmed. The words had barely left the watch officer's mouth before the first defensive response was already underway. Along the escort screen protecting USS Gerald R. Ford, vertical launch cells burst open in rapid succession, sending interceptors into the morning sky with a force that rattled steel and rolled waves of fire across the gray decks. The quiet passage through Hormuz was finished. From that point on, every second belonged to the engagement cycle. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical display tightened into layers of urgency. Inbound tracks were dropping fast, skimming low over the water and moving unpredictably, using the shoreline and sea clutter to stay masked until the last possible moment. The first missiles were not high, dramatic, or easy to pick out. They were low, fast, and designed to appear almost too late to stop. One destroyer on the outer screen took the first shot. A long-range interceptor climbed hard, banking into the threat axis as the ship's radar locked the incoming path. Seconds later, another escort committed to a separate engagement on a different track, adding redundancy to the defense. The doctrine was unmistakable. Never rely on a single intercept, never assume the first picture is complete, and never allow the carrier to become the final shield by default. At 5:48, the first intercept lit up the eastern horizon. No one on Ford's bridge needed an explanation. A sudden bloom of fire hung low above the water, followed by fragments falling into the strait in a widening arc. One inbound was gone, but the attack was far from over. The second missile kept coming, its path shifting just enough to complicate fire control. Then a third appeared moments later, late enough to suggest staggered timing rather than a clean, simultaneous launch. That mattered. It meant the attackers were not relying on volume alone. They were trying to break rhythm, forcing defenders to assign weapons again and again, while reaction windows kept shrinking. Multiple inbounds, different spacing, one controller reported. That was the real danger. On the flight deck, all non-essential movement had stopped. The vast open surface of USS Gerald R. Ford, usually defined by motion, hand signals, engine noise, and carefully coordinated aviation power, had become a hardened platform of secured aircraft, crouched deck crews, and emergency teams waiting in helmets and flash gear. No one needed to see the incoming threats yet to know the ship had crossed into combat. At 5:49, the drones moved in closer. They came low and dispersed, not as one dense mass but in offset packets. Each one threatened to steal a radar channel, a fire control solution, or a split second of attention from the larger anti-ship threat. Small contacts flickered through the clutter. Some dropped lower, some shifted bearing just enough to force another check. On the outer escorts, close-in weapon systems swung and tracked, searching for clear firing lines through the noise. The atmosphere changed with them. Inside CIC, the voices remained controlled, almost clinical. Range, bearing, speed, confidence, weapons free within assigned parameters. Outside, over the water, the fight sounded entirely different. Missile launches cracking from the escorts, warning alarms rolling across exposed decks, and the hard mechanical growl of systems turning toward their targets. Then one of the inbounds pushed through the first defensive layer. Not through the formation, through the first layer. That distinction mattered to everyone in the room. A sea-skimming missile drove deeper into the screen than the others, running just above the surface with unsettling stability. One escort assigned an additional interceptor. Another ship prepared to take the handoff if the first attempt failed. The range ticks kept falling. For a moment, it looked too close, too clean, too late. Then the inner defense fired. The intercept happened lower than the first one, close enough to throw burning fragments and spray into the strait near the lead elements of the formation. Sailors on exposed watch positions saw debris hit the water and skip outward in short, violent bursts. It was no longer an abstract near miss. It was close enough to hear. At 5:50, the fast attack craft surged. They had used the missile exchange exactly as intended. While attention was pulled upward and outward, they pressed harder across the surface, driving in on split vectors and forcing the escorts to guard against a second kind of threat. Some boats stayed close together. Others widened their approach, creating uncertainty over which were screening, which were bait, and which were closing for a short-range strike. One destroyer answered with a sharp maneuver, cutting its bow across a danger lane to widen the protective angle between the boats and the carrier. It was an aggressive move in confined water, executed without hesitation. On Ford, the bridge team adjusted with it, maintaining formation discipline while preserving the carrier's room to react if the surface threat broke inward. At 5:51, another warning call cut across CIC, new tracks. Different bearing, heavier count. For a brief moment, no one said more than the required words. They did not need to. The meaning was already visible on every display. The first missiles, the probing drones, the surface rush, none of it had been the main blow. It had been the opening move designed to draw defensive fire, expose reactions, and occupy the screen. The second wave was now inbound, and this one was larger. The watch officer leaned toward the tactical display, eyes locked, voice flat and steady. The first wave was the setup. Across the formation, launchers were already cycling for the next engagement. The escorts had absorbed the initial shock. The carrier remained intact. The screen was still holding. But out over the Strait of Hormuz, a new line of threats was racing toward USS Gerald R. Ford from a different axis. And this time, the attack was arriving with even greater weight, 5:51 local time. The second wave did not appear all at once. It built itself on the screens in fragments. One track here, three more there. A cluster forming low along the coast, another set emerging from deeper water at a different angle. That was what made the situation even more dangerous. It was not a single force charging in all at once, but a widening pattern built to stretch the defense in every direction. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical display no longer resembled a routine transit disrupted by trouble. It had become a full combat picture. New inbound group bearing 085, additional surface contacts widening north, shore emitters active again. The reports came in sharp, controlled bursts, each one adding pressure to a formation already under strain. The first missile wave had been stopped, but not cleanly enough for anyone to ease off. Weapons had already been used. Attention had already been divided. And now the geometry of the fight was shifting faster than the ships themselves could reposition. USS Gerald R. Ford remained at the center of the formation, still pushing forward through Hormuz, but the sea around her had become a tightly compressed combat zone. Along the carrier's flanks, the escorts adjusted once again, widening their arcs where possible and accepting tighter risk where necessary. There was no open water here, no space for sweeping maneuver. Every decision was boxed in by coastlines, civilian shipping lanes, and the need to shield the carrier from threats approaching from several directions at once. At 5:52, the threat from shore became sharper. Electronic support teams detected fresh spikes in emissions from land. Not random, not exploratory. The pattern suggested coordination, handoff, and timing. Someone ashore was helping shape the attack. That changed everything. The incoming surface and air threats were no longer the only concern. The coastline itself had become part of the engagement chain. One controller isolated a new set of low tracks slipping out of the clutter near shore. Possible missile profile! The room tightened again. This time, the danger was not only what was moving toward the strike group, but where it was emerging from. Water ahead. Water abeam, shoreline on one side, civilian traffic scattered across the transit lanes. Every sector demanded focus and none could be ignored. At 5:53, the Iranian fast attack craft began spreading out even farther. They were no longer simply rushing forward, they were shaping approach lanes. Some stayed low and direct, forcing the outer escorts to treat them as immediate threats. Others widened into positions that made them harder to classify quickly against the mix of surface traffic and environmental clutter. On the tactical display, they formed a loose crescent that seemed less like a direct strike and more like an attempt to stretch around the formation. That was the real trap. Not encirclement in a dramatic cinematic sense, but tactical encirclement. Enough pressure from enough directions that every U.S. ship had to defend several vulnerabilities at the same time. On one of the destroyers screening forward, the commanding officer made the kind of decision that changes the character of a fight. He pushed his ship farther out than the original plan required, taking a more exposed intercept position to cut across the most dangerous surface approach. It was a calculated risk. By widening his angle, he improved protection for the carrier. At the same time, he placed his own ship closer to where the next missile or rocket strike was most likely to fall. The destroyer turned anyway. At 5:54, the atmosphere on Ford's flight deck shifted again. Until then, aviation had remained largely frozen in a defensive posture. Aircraft were secured, crews stayed low, and movement was limited to what was absolutely necessary. Now that logic began to change. The surface threat was pushing deeper, and the formation needed eyes and pressure farther out. Preparations began to launch air assets under combat conditions. The deck stayed disciplined, but the energy changed. Yellow shirts moved with greater urgency. Crews cleared paths. A helicopter team and alert fighters were brought closer to readiness. Not because the air picture had improved, but because the surface picture was becoming more dangerous by the minute. Far below, inside CIC, there was no sense of spectacle, only calculation. Launch decisions were discussed in terms of timing windows, bearing clearance, and margin for survival. Need standoff pressure on the boats, air picture still dirty, surface picture getting worse. It was not a discussion about whether to respond. It was a calculation of when the danger of waiting had become greater than the danger of launching. At 5:55, the drones came in again, not as a single wave, but in packets. Small groups separated by altitude and timing, forcing repeated reassessment. Some appeared to pressure the escorts. Others seemed to bend toward the carrier's axis, not necessarily to score a hit, but to drag weapons and radar attention inward at the exact moment the fast boats were drawing closer. Close-in systems on the outer screen came alive again, tracking, shifting, recalculating. One drone was destroyed cleanly. Another broke apart late, scattering debris across the water. But even successful interceptions had a cost: time, concentration, and engagement opportunities. Then the most dangerous track of the morning appeared. It came in low, late, and nearly hidden until the last possible moment by overlapping returns from shore and surface clutter. For a brief instant, the inbound track aligned on a path that pointed straight through the defensive geometry toward USS Gerald R. Ford. On the tactical display, it was just one symbol among many. Inside the room, everyone understood it differently. That one mattered. A destroyer took the first engagement. Another stood ready as backup. Electronic warfare teams pushed hard against the incoming track, trying to disrupt its guidance or reduce its accuracy. For 2 or 3 seconds, the range dropped fast. No one in CIC looked anywhere else. The intercept came in close, too close to feel routine. The burst flashed low over the water, near enough that the shock carried through the tactical network before visual confirmation even came in. Debris splashed down inside the defended space of the formation. Not on the carrier, not on the escorts, but close enough to make the margin feel razor thin. At 5:56, the first U.S. aircraft finally launched. Their arrival did not end the fight. It changed the tempo. Now the Iranian fast boats were no longer advancing toward ships that could only screen and absorb pressure. They were being tracked from above, forced to react, forced to maneuver under a new kind of threat. One group broke formation almost immediately, turning away instead of pressing forward. Another tried to hold its line, but with less timing, less confidence, and less protection from the confusion that had worked in its favor just minutes earlier. That was the first sign the attack was beginning to lose cohesion. The Strait of Hormuz was still a trap. Missiles were still inbound. Shore-based emitters were still active. Drones still flickered through the clutter. But for the first time since the engagement began, the pressure was no longer tightening evenly around USS Gerald R. Ford. Somewhere inside the chaos, the formation had started to push back. At 5:56 local time, the first U.S. aircraft cleared the deck into a sky already layered with smoke, radar activity, and the fading structure of the earlier attack pattern. Their launch did not feel triumphant. It felt necessary. Below them, Ford continued moving through the strait, her escorts still locked into a defensive screen that had been under constant pressure for nearly 10 minutes. The change now was subtle, but critical. The formation was no longer just enduring the attack, it was beginning to read it. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical picture remained dense, but the chaos had started to separate into recognizable patterns. Iranian fast attack craft were no longer moving with the same precision they had shown at the start. Their vectors widened, their timing slipped. Drone groups were still arriving, but less synchronized. Shore-based emissions continued, though without the same clean coordination that had driven the earlier phases. The threat was still real, but it was no longer perfectly aligned. At 5:57, one destroyer on the outer screen made the first decisive countermove. Instead of holding a purely reactive position, it pushed forward across the carrier's most vulnerable surface approach lane, forcing the nearest fast boats into a choice: either continue forward into exposure or break off and lose their angle. It was a bold repositioning in confined waters, the kind that only works when a crew fully trusts its systems, its leadership, and the ships around it. The boats reacted immediately. Two held their course just a moment too long, trying to maintain pressure. Then U.S. aircraft entered their space. From above, the aircraft did not need to engage every contact to shift the balance. Their speed alone changed the equation. Boats that had seemed dangerous while hidden in clutter and timing now had to think about exposure, separation, and survival. One group veered outward, another began to stagger. A third tried to blend into nearby surface traffic, but the coordinated formation they had built earlier was gone. At 5:58, another incoming salvo was detected. This time, the response was faster. The escort screen had adapted. Track assignments were cleaner. Weapon allocation was more precise. No rushed actions, no hesitation. A long-range interceptor launched first, followed by a second engagement from another ship, taking the next threat before it could push deeper into the defended space. A third inbound was handed off smoothly across sectors. It was clear now, the ships were no longer reacting second by second. They were adjusting in real time. One missile was intercepted far enough out that the flash seemed distant. Another was neutralized lower, breaking apart and scattering fragments into the water well short of the formation. The difference was clear. Earlier, every intercept had felt like a last-second effort. Now the defense was regaining depth. Not safety, depth. At 5:59, Ford's flight deck resumed limited combat activity. It was not a return to routine. It was something more important, a sign that the carrier remained fully operational under sustained pressure. Crews moved with focused urgency across the deck, launching support assets, clearing space, and preparing for whatever the next moment would demand. The ship had been challenged from the surface, from the air, and from coordinated shore-based targeting. And still, the flight deck was active. In a situation like this, that alone carried enormous significance. Inside CIC, no one paused to acknowledge it. Their attention was already on the next shift in the fight. Electronic warfare teams were now beginning to see measurable impact. Coordination on the opposing side was starting to slip. By 6 o'clock, the pattern of the attack was beginning to come apart. Tracks that had earlier reflected tight coordination were now showing small but meaningful breaks. Contacts were arriving out of sequence. Drone groups were drifting away from useful approach paths. Surface units were spreading too far apart to keep up concentrated pressure. Whether the cause was jamming, losses, or simple breakdown under sustained resistance, the assault was losing its timing. At 6 o'clock, one Iranian missile boat made the mistake that shifted the tone of the fight. Instead of pulling away with the others, it pushed deeper in, trying to exploit what its crew likely believed was one final gap along the edge of the American screen. But that gap no longer existed. A U.S. aircraft overhead already had the contact locked. An escort ship was covering the lane. The boat's aggressive move, which might have posed a serious danger just 3 minutes earlier, now left it isolated from the rest of the attacking force. For the first time, one of the attacking units no longer looked like part of a coordinated offensive. It looked exposed. The American response was immediate and controlled. Tracking tightened. Pressure from above forced the boat into a sharp turn, throwing spray as it tried to escape the very lane it had just entered. Its retreat sent a clear signal to every nearby unit still trying to hold position. The screen was no longer bending around them, it was pushing back. At 6:01, another small drone group attempted to slip inward through the clutter, but the timing was off. The escorts were ready. One drone was engaged early, another was disrupted before it could settle into a stable run. A third broke off its approach completely, either damaged, jammed, or stripped of a workable targeting solution. These were not dramatic moments. They were better than that. They showed the defense was working. On the bridge of USS Gerald R. Ford, everything remained controlled, disciplined, almost unsettlingly calm. Orders continued in the same clipped tone as before. Maintain formation, preserve spacing, keep moving. The carrier did not turn the battle into spectacle, it simply refused to stop. At 6:02, the last organized Iranian surface element still pressing forward began to turn away. It did not happen in one instant. One boat eased off first, then another widened out. Then the remaining line lost its shape and began to withdraw under relentless tracking from U.S. ships and aircraft. They were no longer advancing, they were disengaging. The missiles had not disabled the carrier. The drones had not overwhelmed the screen. The fast boats had not broken the formation. And now, for the first time since 5:42, the American strike group had something more than endurance. It had momentum. USS Gerald R. Ford continued through Hormuz, smoke hanging low over the water behind her, escorts still alert. Aircraft overhead, while an attack that had begun with confidence was now breaking apart into a scattered retreat. The engagement was not fully over, but the direction of it was becoming clear. 6:02 local time. The surviving Iranian boats were pulling away, but no one aboard Ford mistook withdrawal for safety. Not in Hormuz. Not after layered missile strikes, drones timed to divide attention, and fast surface craft that had pushed close enough to test the screen from every difficult angle. Encounters like this did not end simply because the attacker broke formation. They ended only when every remaining threat was located, tracked, and either neutralized or forced beyond effective range. On the bridge, the captain kept his eyes forward. No victory call, no visible release of tension. Just the next sequence of orders delivered in the same clipped tone that had carried the ship through the worst of the fight. Maintain formation, confirm sector integrity, keep the carrier moving. The discipline never changed because the danger had not fully disappeared. A retreating attacker could still launch one final shot. A damaged drone could still drift into defended space. A shore battery that had gone quiet could still have one more attempt left. At 6:03, the tactical picture finally began to thin. Inside CIC, the dense cluster of flashing symbols and overlapping bearings that had defined the last 20 minutes started to separate into smaller, more manageable groups. Some contacts were withdrawing quickly, some had disappeared under confirmed intercepts, others were still being tracked outward to ensure they were truly leaving and not circling back for another run. One controller updated the surface picture. Multiple contacts disengaging north. Another followed with the air picture. Remaining low track scattered, no coordinated inbound profile. That was the first real sign the attack had broken, not because every hostile unit had been destroyed, not because the sea had suddenly gone quiet, but because the assault had lost the one thing it needed most to succeed: timing. The missiles, drones, and fast boats had been most dangerous when they arrived as one connected threat, each element covering the weakness of the others. Now they were only fragments, and fragments could be handled. At 6:04, damage control reports began coming in from ship to ship across the formation. The priorities were brutally simple: fires, flooding, casualties, mission-critical systems. On the escorts, teams moved through compartments, checking for shock damage, fragment impacts, and system wear after repeated launches and close defensive engagements. On forward, repair lockers reported status in measured bursts. Flight deck crews checked for debris hazards, blast damage, and contamination that could interfere with ongoing operations. Medical teams confirmed that the worst-case scenarios they had prepared for had not come to pass. The carrier remained operational. That mattered more than any single interception. The goal of the attack had never been just to create chaos in the Strait. It had been to stop USS Gerald R. Ford, to damage her, isolate her, or force the entire strike group into defensive paralysis. None of that happened. The carrier stayed in formation, under command, and under power for the entire engagement. At 6:05, the flight deck confirmed what the bridge already understood. The air wing could continue limited combat operations. There was no celebration aboard a U.S. Navy carrier. Operational capability is not a show. It's a checklist. Can the deck function? Can aircraft move safely? Can crews launch and recover under control? Can the ship still project force after a coordinated attempt to break its rhythm? One by one, the answers came back. Yes. Over the water, American aircraft continued tracking the withdrawing surface contacts. They didn't rush forward recklessly. They maintained pressure, monitored movement, and denied any chance for the attackers to regroup within effective range. One Iranian boat that had fallen behind briefly turned, as if considering one last move, then broke away again under constant overhead presence and the unbroken line of U.S. ships. At 6:06, the escorts began shifting back into control mode. Launch systems were reassessed, radar coverage was redistributed, expenditure levels were updated, communication channels, which had been compressed into rapid second-by-second survival traffic, started to expand just enough to support structured coordination again. The change was subtle but significant. Earlier, every call had carried immediate consequence. Now there was enough room to reestablish deliberate control. That was when the emotional center of the fight shifted. During the attack, everything had been about survival. Track the next threat, protect the carrier, hold the line. But afterward, another reality became clear. The attack had not just been stopped. It had strengthened the formation. The very systems that had been pushed to their limits had adapted, recovered their rhythm, and turned a confined danger zone into a controlled passage. At 6:07, a senior watchstander in CIC replayed the geometry of the closest intercept on the main display. For a moment, the room watched a digital reconstruction of the inbound track that had pushed deeper than the rest, the one that had nearly reached the carrier's inner defensive space before being intercepted low over the water. On the screen, it was just a line, a speed value, and a termination point. But everyone in the room knew what those seconds had felt like. They understood how narrow the margin had been, how easily the situation could have gone another way. That awareness didn't create fear, it created clarity. At 6:08, USS Gerald R. Ford continued her transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Smoke still lingered in broken layers over sections of water where intercepts had taken place. Debris fields drifted slowly outward. Farther away, the withdrawing attackers had faded into distant contacts under constant observation. The escorts held their positions along the defensive perimeter, radars active, systems manned, crews still operating at a level of readiness that assumed the situation could change again without warning. But at the center of it all, nothing had broken. The carrier that entered the engagement at 5:42 was still there at 6:08, moving, operational, protected, and steady. The attack had come in layers. Missiles from the coast and sea, drones timed to divide attention, fast boats pushing in to exploit confusion and narrow waters. It was a coordinated effort built around pressure, timing, and momentum. And still, USS Gerald R. Ford kept going. No dramatic conclusion was needed. The outcome was already written across the water. The attack came in waves. The defense held. The formation adapted, and as the smoke began to thin over Hormuz, the ship at the center of it all was still underway.